In this video, I'm going to teach you how to use Prisma in your Nest application. Prisma is an object relational mapper for SQL and NoSQL databases such as MySQL and MongoDB. With Prisma, you use a schema-based approach to define your models, and those models map to a database table for relational databases or a document for NoSQL databases. It's very popular and easy to use, so let's go ahead and get started with setting up Prisma. I went ahead and created a very simple project for us. It has two modules and it has a controller and a service already set up, though we still need to implement methods and implement the logic for those methods. We'll focus on the users module first, and then later on we will work on the posts module. So the first thing that we're going to do is set up Prisma. So to get started, we need to go ahead and install Prisma for our project. So in your terminal, type npm i-d Prisma. So we'll save Prisma as a developer dependency, and this will install the Prisma CLI for us. And if you look at your node modules folder, you should see that there is this Prisma binary right over here inside the .bin folder. So we can use the Prisma CLI by typing npx Prisma, and this will allow us to use the Prisma CLI. So what we want to do is initialize Prisma. So we're just going to type npx Prisma init, just like this. And what this will do is create a folder called Prisma, as you can see on the left-hand side. And it will also create a .env file. So this Prisma folder will contain everything related with your Prisma schemas. When we get into database migrations, they will also be inside this Prisma folder as well. So the first thing that you'll see here is this generator client. You don't have to worry so much about this. All you need to know is that this takes care of actually generating the assets based on your Prisma model. So the way that it works is when we define a Prisma model, that Prisma model is going to map to a database table for our SQL database. And then what we're going to need to do is generate these assets based off of our Prisma model. And those assets are pretty much just TypeScript types or interfaces, classes, things like that. But mostly they're actually just types and interfaces that Prisma will generate for you. And this is what is going to allow you to interact with your database using the Prisma client while also having type safety when you reference your models such as a user or a post. You'll see later on when we reference the Prisma client on what I'm talking about. Right over here, we have our data source. And we have a provider, so by default, it configures it to use Postgres. We're just going to set it to MySQL. But again, if you're using Postgres, you can leave it alone as Postgres. And then we have the URL set right over here, and it uses .env to point to this database URL, which is inside the .env file, which was created for us when we ran npx Prisma init. So it just has this database URL. I'm going to go ahead and very quickly configure it. So since I'm using MySQL, I'm going to change Postgres to MySQL. And then over here, we want to configure our username and password. So right where it says John Doe, that's the username. So you're going to type your username. So I'll put mine, test user. And then where it says random password, this is where you're going to put your password for your database user account. So mine is test user 123. So test user : and then test user 123, and then @ so this over here, localhost, my database is running locally, so I'm going to leave it as localhost. But if you're using a remote database, then you would make sure you provide the remote server's hostname. So I'm going to leave it as localhost, and then the port is going to be 3306. And then for the database itself, I'm going to go ahead and call it NestJS Prisma DB. So let's go ahead and go back to our schema.prisma file. Now, one thing that I do want to mention very quickly is you want to make sure you also install the Prisma extension in VS Code. So you want to go over to extensions and you want to search for Prisma. And then you want to install this one right over here. So this will make sure that you have syntax highlighting, formatting, auto-completion, all those kind of things. So that's the reason why you can see that some of these keywords are highlighted and there's color highlighting over here. So just wanted to mention that very quickly. So what we want to do now is we want to go inside our schema.prisma file and we want to create our first model. So I'll create a few. So let's start off with a simple user model. So we're going to use the model keyword and we're going to give our model a name. So I'll call it user and then provide a pair of curly braces. So inside my model, I want to go ahead and define fields for this model, which will then get mapped into a column in our user table in the database. I'm going to start off with a simple ID, and the data type, Prisma also has their own data types as well. So I'm going to set it as int, just like this. There's also big int if you need big int. I'll leave it as int for now. And I want to make sure that this user ID field is a primary key and that also auto increments every single time we create a new user. So to do that, I'm going to need to use what is called an annotation as well as an annotation function. So there is this annotation called default. And then inside default, we can provide a default value. So I can provide 1, 2, 3, or I can provide a string if this ID was in fact a string. But in this case, I want the default value to be an auto-incremented value. So we're going to use the auto-increment annotation function. And that is passed in as an argument to default, just like this. Now, since this ID is going to be an actual primary key, we also want to make sure that we use the ID annotation right over here. So that way we let Prisma know that this is actually going to be a primary key. So let's go ahead and define a few more fields. We'll do one for username. So this is going to be a string. And I want to make sure that my username for this user model is going to be unique because we don't want multiple records in our database having the same exact username. That wouldn't make any sense in a realistic application. So we can use the @unique annotation just like this. And this will mark username as a unique value. And let's go ahead and do one for display name. So display name, I want this to be a string, but I also want to mark it as optional. So what I can do is I can use the question mark operator at the end of the data type. So this marks display name as optional or nullable. If you wanted to add a default value for display name, you could also just do @default and pass in an empty string like this. Okay, let's create a few more models. So for now, we will only use the user model, but later on in the video, when we get to one-to-one and one-to-many and many-to-one relationships, I'll show you how we can connect the user model with our other models that we're going to create. So I'll create a model called user setting, and this will just relate to settings for the user. So let's say, for example, we want them to have a setting to indicate that they have notifications enabled. So we'll do notifications on, and this will be a Boolean, just like that. And we also want to make sure that this user setting model also has a unique ID. So that could be very similar to what we have for our user model. So for user setting, I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste the same exact thing right over here. Okay, but this ID is for the user setting model. So let's go ahead and do another field. We'll call this SMS enabled. And we'll set this to be a Boolean. We'll keep it very simple for now. And I'll go ahead and define one more model. I'll call it posts or post. And we need the same thing. We need an ID, a primary key. So we're going to do the same thing right over here. And then I'll have a title for the post, which is going to be a string. And then I want a description as well. And then we'll leave the other stuff for later on in this video, because we, of course, for this post, we want to relate the user with the post, and we also want to relate the user with the user setting, but we'll save that for later on in the video when we get to relations. So now what we need to do is we need to run a database migration, or a SQL migration in this case. So every single time you perform some kind of update with your model in Prisma, you need to make sure you run a migration. What that does is it will take the changes that you made to your model and actually apply them to the actual database itself. So we need to first go into our terminal. So let's go here. And then what I'm going to do is type npx prisma migrate dev. And then we want to give this migration a name. So I'll go ahead and do -- name. And I'll just call this initdb, just like that. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And what's going to happen is you're going to see that a bunch of stuff happened. So first, it was able to successfully connect to the database, so that's good. So it was able to create the database, as you can see right over here, because the database did not exist. And then it creates this migration.sql file right over here. And all this literally is just a bunch of SQL queries. So you can see that we are creating a table called user, creating the user setting, and the post. So once this migration.sql file is created, it's going to go ahead and execute that file to create the actual tables in this case. So once that is done, there's a command called Prisma Generate, which is automatically invoked whenever we run Prisma Migrate. And this is where it will actually take the updates of your model. So if there are any updates, it'll go ahead and generate assets for you. And you can actually take a look at it inside the node modules folder. If you actually go inside .prisma, you can actually go inside the index.js file and you can search for it. It's somewhere over here. So you can see over here we have one for user scalar field enum, and then we have the ID, username, display name, and then this is the user settings scalar field enum, and this is post right over here. So they are creating these types for us, and there's a bunch of more types that are generated for us whenever we run Prisma Generate. So we'll explore them later on, but I just want to show you very quickly where you can find that inside this Prisma folder. So now what we can actually do is we can actually go into our code and reference the Prisma client. Using the Prisma client, we can actually interact with our database and create records for a user setting, a post. We can go ahead and query the database to retrieve the records. We can update the records. Whatever it is that we want, we can now do that with the Prisma client. Now, one thing that I will also mention is that when you run Prisma Migrate for the first time, it will also install the Prisma client for you. So you can see that in my package.json file, I have Prisma client as a dependency, which I did not install myself. So I just wanted to mention that. But if for some reason you don't have Prisma client, just make sure you install it by typing npm i@prisma/client, just like that. So let's go ahead and run our code. Let's start up our server. Let's type npm run start:dev. Let's make sure everything is working fine. So you can see that our entire code is working. There are no errors. And if you want to, what you can do is you can actually log into your own database. So I'll do that very quickly. So use NestJS _Prisma_DB. And I'm going to type show tables. And you can see that I have all of my tables created right over here. And I can describe each table. You can see that this is the schema definition for my user table. And you'll see how they are properly mapped to an actual database table from those Prisma models. So just wanted to show you that very quickly. So let me move this to the other screen. So now we want to actually use the Prisma client in our NestJS project. So what we can do is first, let's create a new module. So I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it Prisma. And I'm going to create a new file and I'll call it prisma.module.ts. So the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to be able to create this Prisma module, and then I want to be able to import it anywhere in my application that I need it. So we're going to use the module decorator, and we'll use that to annotate this Prisma module class that I'm creating. And inside the module decorator, we want to pass an object, and we want to set, we don't really have any imports. We really only are going to need providers and exports. So let's go ahead and create another file, and I'll call it prisma.service.ts. And I'm going to create a class, and I'll call this Prisma Service. And this Prisma Service is going to be a provider, so let's mark it with the injectable decorator, like that. And I want to extend the Prisma Client class. Okay, just like this. So we're going to import Prisma Client from the @prisma/client package, just like this. And then what we want to do is we want to implement this on-module init interface, which comes from the core NestJS library, okay, NestJS common. So what I want to do is I want to implement this on-module init method, just like that. And essentially what I want to do is whenever this Prisma service class is initialized, I want to go ahead and connect to the database. If you don't do this, which you don't have to, what happens is whenever you try to query the database, it's going to lazily connect to the database. Okay, Prisma will lazily connect to the database. So we can go ahead and reference this dot, and since we extended the Prisma client class, we inherit all of these methods that come from Prisma client. So we want to go ahead and call this dot connect, this $connect method, like that. And this returns a promise. So I can go ahead and actually just I can handle the promise by calling .then. We don't really need to do anything else. I'm just going to go ahead and just write a console log and say connected to DB. And then if there are any errors, we'll handle it by catching it. And I'll just go ahead and do console log error connecting to DB. Or actually, you know what? I'll just log the error, just like that. Now, what we want to do is add our Prisma service as a provider in our Prisma module. So let's do that, Prisma service, add that to the providers array. Now, since we're going to be importing the Prisma module to our users module right over here and our posts module later on, we want to make sure that we add the Prisma service as an export, because we are going to need to inject the Prisma service into our users service class. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and just add that over there and just close out of the Prisma module file. So now, if I go into my users.service.ts file, I can go ahead and first set up a constructor. And before we inject the Prisma service, we want to go ahead into our users.module.ts. And we want to go ahead and import Prisma module just like that. Let's make sure that our dependencies are successfully initialized. And you can see right over here in the console, you can see that Prisma module dependencies initialized. And you can also see that it was able to successfully connect to the database. So that's good. Okay. And if I remove that and save, it's going to go ahead and not do anything at all. So this verifies that the Prisma module is in fact being successfully initialized. So that's good. So now we can go back to the users service class, and I'm going to go ahead and inject the Prisma client or the Prisma service. So private Prisma and then Prisma service, just like this. If I look at the logs, you can see that everything is good. Okay, there are no issues with injecting the Prisma service into our users service class because we have Prisma module set up over here. If I were to remove that import, remove that from the imports array, you can see now it is complaining. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. So let's go ahead and continue. So now inside our user service, we're going to define a few methods. So let's do one for creating a user, and then we'll do one for getting a user or get users, and then we'll do one for get user by ID, just like this. Okay, we'll start off with these three for now. We'll implement these as we go along. So we'll start off with create user first. Okay, so create user is going to need an object that is going to have all the fields that we're going to use to create the user itself. We'll worry about that in just a little bit. But what I can do here is I can reference this.prisma, and you see how right over here I have this user property as well as the post and user setting. So this allows you to reference the actual Prisma model itself, and you can actually perform operations on these database models. So by referencing this.prisma.user, I can actually reference a bunch of these methods, as you can see right over here. So for example, if I wanted to create a user, I would call .create just like this, and then I would pass in the appropriate arguments to actually create the user itself. If I wanted to get a user, then I would use something like find first or find unique. There are a bunch of different methods that you can use, so we'll explore them as we progress. So now, here's the thing though, with our user service, and let me just kind of like close the terminal so I can zoom in a little bit more. So with our create user method inside our user service class, we need arguments, right? We need an argument that represents the object that is going to contain the actual fields that the user is going to require in order to be created in the database. So Prisma actually has these auto-generated types that you can use, so you don't have to create them yourself. So what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, I'll call this argument create user data, and then I can type annotate it with this Prisma. So let me import Prisma from @Prisma client. And then if I reference Prisma right over here, you can see that there are a bunch of different types that we can reference right over here. So if I wanted to have one for user, let's see, there's one right over here. Post create, or not post create, it's user create input, just like that. Okay, so you can actually use these auto-generated inputs that were done by Prisma to represent your data that you want to actually create. Okay, so if you actually go to the definition, you can see that it's just a regular type, username, and then display name, just like that. So now, while you should use these auto-generated types, we also want to make sure that we are validating our data as well. So we will also still need a DTO for the control layer, and I'll explain a little bit about that in just a little bit. But you can see that I am type annotating create user data just like this. So it's good to use this so that way we are consistent with what we are passing into our method calls when we interact with the Prisma client. Okay, so for example, we know that the only fields that we need are username and display name. There's not going to be a need for the ID field because that is auto-generated. So what I can do here is I can return this.prisma and then reference user and call create. And then we want to pass in this data property, which is going to map to our create user data object just like that. Okay. And I'm just going to rename this to data so I can just remove this right-hand side. All right, so now all we need to do is just go into our user's controller and we want to inject our user service. So let's do that, private user service, and type annotate it with user's service class. And then we'll go ahead and set up a post request. So I'm going to use the post decorator and I'll call this method create user. And we're going to want to call this.userService.createUser, and then we need to pass in data. So we need to first get the request body. So we can do that by using the @body decorator, just like this. But we need a DTO. Okay. So here's the thing, though. Some people might wonder, well, couldn't I just use the same Prisma type right over here, user create input? Well, you shouldn't, because there's a few reasons why. First of all, you wouldn't actually be able to use something like class validator and the class validator's decorators to properly validate each field. And this itself is a type. And typically for DTOs, you want to actually use a class. So it's good practice to actually use a DTO alongside with the auto-generated Prisma inputs. So what we'll do is we'll create a user DTO. So let me just call this create user DTO. And inside the users folder, I'll create a new folder called DTOs. And I'll create a new file called create user DTO or create user.dto.ts. So I'll create a class called create user DTO. And this is going to represent our request body. So remember, we have a username of type string and display name, which is a string, and it is also nullable. It's optional. Okay, so I want to use class validator to properly validate all of these fields in the request body layer. So I'm going to go ahead and install a package called class validator. So npm I class-validator, just like this. And let's just run our server again. Okay, wonderful. So now I'm going to go ahead and for my username field, I'm going to first make sure that this username field is in fact a string. So I'm going to use the isString decorator, and that comes from class validator. And then I'm also going to make sure that it is not empty. So I'm going to use isNotEmpty, just like that. For display name, we also want to make sure that this is a string if they do provide it. But we also want to mark it as optional. So we'll use the isOptional decorator. So that way it won't complain about us not providing the display name. So let's go back to our controller. And we want to use this usePipes decorator for the create user method. And I'm just going to pass in this validation pipe, just like this. this validation pipe class. And so this will enable validation for our request body for this endpoint. Okay, so let me just go ahead and continue type annotating the create user DTO with the create user DTO class that I just created. And now we have proper validation for the request body, so that's good. So we can go ahead and just pass in create user DTO to create user just like this. Okay, and there shouldn't be any issues with that. All right. So let's go ahead and test out our endpoint. Let's just first make sure that there are no errors in the console. Let's see. And it's also saying that the class transformer package is missing. Oh yeah, let's also install that as well. So npm I class transformer. Yeah, these two packages go well in hand. Class transformer with class validator. It's complaining about this because we installed class validator without class transformer. So make sure you do install that. Okay, so let's run our server again. Make sure there are no issues. Okay, wonderful. There are no issues whatsoever. So now I can go into my Thunder client. You can use whatever HTTP client you want. You can use Postman, whatever it is that you want. I'm going to use Thunder client. I'm going to create a new request. It's going to be a post request. And the URL is going to be localhost at port 3000/users. Okay. So we're going to make a post request. If I send an empty request body, it's going to complain about the username. So we need to make sure we provide the username. So let's do Anson. Display name is optional. So if I click send, this should work. And now you can see that there are no errors. It successfully created our user. So what happened was we validated the request body, and then we called this.userService.createUser. Okay, and then inside over here, create user, we called this.prisma.user.create. We passed in the data, and then we just returned whatever it was that is returned. Okay, we don't have to do additional things such as manually saving to the database like you have to do it in type ORM. Prisma just does all of this for you in one single line, so you don't have to worry about it. So the user that was created was returned as a response, which you can see right over here. Now, if I try to create another user with the same username, it's going to error out because remember, we have that unique constraint on the user itself or on the username. If I show you the logs right over here, you can see it says unique constraint failed on the constraint username key. That constraint is in fact working properly. Let's go ahead and create another user. Let's do display name this time, Anson the dev. There we go. It created one just for us. Okay, so now we know how to create users, so that's good. Let's go ahead and actually query our database to retrieve a list of users. So going back to our users.service.ts file, what I can do is inside get users, I can return this.prisma.user, and I can call this find many method. So what this will do is this will get you all the users based on some filter, some criteria. In our case, we don't really need one right now, but this is very helpful if you want to filter users based on their username, based on their display name. So for now, we'll just get back all the users. So we want to go ahead and call this get users method in the users controller. So let's set up a get request. So we're going to use the get decorator. And we'll go ahead and call this method get users. And we'll just return this.userService.getUsers, just like that. And this will return an array of users. So if I go into Thunder Client, if I make a get request to the user's endpoint, it's going to give me back 2 users that I created, okay, the array of users, just like that. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, let's say if I wanted to get a user by its ID. That isn't so difficult. So the first thing that we need is the ID of the user. So inside the user service for get user by ID, I'm going to expect one argument, the ID, which is going to be a numeric value. Okay, because remember our ID for the user is a number. So what we're going to do is on the user reference on the Prisma client itself, we're going to call find unique. Okay, so since we know that these IDs are going to be unique. There's not going to be two users with the same ID. We can use find unique in this case. Okay, so in find unique, we want to pass in an object, and this object is going to have this where property that we need to set, which is going to be an object. And this is where you're going to set the actual condition based on the user that you want to find. So in this case, we want to search by the ID. So we want to set the ID property just like this. So ID maps to ID just like that. But we can do it shorthand because the field name is the same name as the argument over here. So this will search for the user by its ID. Now, if you need to search for the user by the username, because we know the username field is unique, then you would just replace ID with username like this, and then you would pass in the username value. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and go into our user's controller, and let's set up an endpoint to get the user by the ID. So we're going to use a get request. This time we're going to specify a route parameter. So it's going to look like :ID, just like this. And then we're going to call the method get user by ID. And we're just going to simply grab the route parameter from the path. And we can do that by using the @params or @param decorator. And then I can just specify the route parameter that I want to get, so ID. Now, keep in mind that this parses the route parameter as a string. We want to make sure that it is a number. So we want to go ahead and as a second argument to the param decorator, we want to pass in this parse int pipe just like this. So this will take care of not only validating the route parameter for us, but also transforming it from a numeric string into an actual numeric value. So then I'll type annotate ID into number, just like that. And remember, parse int pipe is imported from NestJS common. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll just return this .usersService.getUserById. We'll just return that method call. And now watch this. If I go ahead and try to pass in an ID for the user that I know does not exist, it's 200. So it's still going to return a status of 200. We'll fix that in just a little bit. But notice how if I pass in a string like this ABC, it's going to give me a 400 status code. It's going to say a validation field numeric string is expected. Okay, so that's good. But if I pass in, let's say, ID of 1, it's going to give me back this user right over here. Okay, let's go ahead and adjust our logic. So what we'll do is this. So this find unique actually returns a falsy value if the user was not found. Okay, so for example, if I do const user equals await this .userService.getUserById, let's make sure we add async in front of getUserById in our controller method. I'll console log the user just to show you what happens if the user itself is not found. Oops. Okay, so if I do, let's do 10, you're going to see it says null. So what we can do is, let's say if the user is not found, then I can go ahead and do this. If user is not found, throw a new HTTP exception, and that's also imported from NestJS common, the HTTP exception class. And then we'll just say user not found and send a 44 status code. But if the user is found, we'll just return it just like this. Okay, so now if I try to send this request, it's going to say 44 not found. Now the other option that you have is you can also do find unique or throw, just like this. So this will actually throw an error for you if the user was not found. So if I save and if I click send, you're going to see that even though we used find unique or throw, that error that was thrown is not something that is handled by NestJS. Okay, so you do want to keep in mind of that. So hopefully this makes sense. So now I'll show you how we can update our users. So inside my user service class, I'll set up a method. I'll call this update user by ID. So we're going to need two arguments. One, we need the ID of the user. And two, we need the actual object of what the client wants to update the user with. So for example, when you update a user, do you want to update the username? Do you want to update the display name? What is it that you want to update? So this is going to be an object. So we can actually use the Prisma auto-generated types. So I'll call this data and I'll reference Prisma, and there should be one for updates, user updates input, just like that. And if I hover over this, you can see that the only two possible fields that you can update are username or display name. So we'll use that update user input. All right, so now what we want to do first inside update user by ID is we want to search for the user and see if the user exists. So we know how to search for the user. So in fact, I can actually just call a get user by ID. So const find user equals. So what I'll do now is I'll call get user by ID. Remember that this returns a promise, so we need to await it. So get user by ID and pass in the ID like that. And then let me add the async keyword. Okay. Now, if the user is not found, we'll throw a new HTTP exception, and we'll just say user not found 44. Now, if the user is found, we also want to make sure that we are checking to see if the username that they want to update theirs with is that username already taken by someone else. Because remember, the username field has a unique constraint. So we need to first check to see if the data.username is defined, because there's a chance that the client is not updating the user's username. So we don't have to worry about that at all. But if the user name is in fact going to be updated, then we need to check for that. So what I'll do is I'll say if data.username, if this is defined, then what we'll do is we'll search for the user by the username. So to do that, first I'll actually just reuse this find user variable because I'm inside this scope over here. So I can actually just redeclare this variable inside the scope. And then what I'll do is I'll use await, and we'll do this.prisma.user find unique. We're going to search for the user by the username. And then we'll do where username is equal to data.username, like that. So you're seeing right over here that it is complaining about type string or string field update operations input is not assignable to type string. I'm just going to go ahead and cast this as a string. So now what we'll do is we'll check to see if the user was not found. So if, let's say for example, if the user is found, then what we'll do here is we'll actually throw an exception and we'll just say username already taken. And then we'll set the status code to 400. Okay, so if find user is defined, which means that the user was in fact found, which means that the username is taken, then we'll throw this exception. I'm doing it this way so I can avoid nesting a bunch of logic. So this way, this will exit out of this function or this method, and we can continue without nesting anything. If the user was not found, then what we can do is we can just update everything. Okay, we don't have to worry about display name because we know display name is not a unique value and there's no constraint on it. So at this point, what I can do is I can actually just go outside of this if case, because let's say, for example, if we're not actually trying to update the username, then that means data.username will be undefined because we didn't provide a username for the field. So we can actually just go ahead and call this.prisma.user update. And then we can just set where. So the ID is going to be passed in over here. So we know which user it is that we're trying to update. And then we'll pass in data like this. Okay. So just to go through everything, if let's say we are in fact wanting to update the username, then we need to perform this check right over here inside this if condition. So we have to search for the user by the username that we want to use to update with. If that username is taken, then we're just going to throw this HTTP exception. Okay. So that means it'll exit out of this entire method and return that as a response. However, if the user was not found based on that username that we're trying to use as our new username, then it will not throw this error. And then we'll just exit out of this if condition, and then we'll just go ahead and call this method over here. Okay, So this will ensure that we don't do it twice, because I could have also just called it up top over here as well. But it makes sense to just leave it as one line down over here, because if we're not trying to update the username, then data will only have, let's say, display name. Then we're only going to just update display name, and we don't have to worry about username being modified at all. So hopefully that makes sense. So now we need to go into our controller layer. So inside users.controller.ts, we're going to go ahead and set up a patch request. And we need a route parameter, which is going to be the user's ID. It's going to look very similar to get user by ID. So let me just copy this part. And I'm going to call the method update user by ID and pass in this right over here. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call this .userService.update user by ID. And we need to pass in two arguments. Remember, we need the ID as well as the actual update user object itself, which is going to contain the username or the display name or both. So in this case, we should also set up a DTO for this, similar to what we did for the post request. Instead of using the Prisma auto-generated types, you should only use the Prisma auto-generated types for the service layer only, not for the control layer. Because remember what I said earlier, if you use the Prisma auto-generated types in the control layer, it's actually not going to take care of the validation for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a DTO called update user.dto.ts. And it's going to look very similar to create user DTO. I'm going to change this to update user DTO. Only difference is that instead of username being required, we're going to mark it as optional. And same thing, we also want to make sure that it is a string. And then same thing for display name. And username should also have a question mark in front of it as well. So that way both username and display name are optional. Okay, so this is our update user DTO. So let's go over here and let's do @body and then update user DTO. And then we'll type annotate it with our update user DTO class, just like that. And now we'll pass in update user DTO as an argument. And there are no issues with TypeScript whatsoever. Okay, and we'll just return this call. All right, so let's go ahead and make a patch request. So I'm going to try to update the user of ID 3. So the username is Anson1. Let's update it to Anson2. So we're going to pass 3 as the route parameter. And for the username, I'm going to set it to Anson2. And I'll leave display name alone. And now I can see that the username was in fact updated to Anson2. If I go ahead and try to retrieve that user by the ID, the username was in fact updated correctly. Now, if I try to update it to Anson, a username that is already taken, it's going to go ahead and give us back this 400 status code. And remember, that is being thrown right over here. If the user was found by the username, that means that the username is already taken by someone else. So we throw the error. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to update it to Anson5, and that works. Let's just update the display name and not the username. Okay, Anson, the developer to 5th. There we go. And let's get all the users. And you can see that everything is working as expected. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, one quick thing that I did want to show you all. So let's just say if I did choose to use Prisma let me import Prisma let's do user create input. So the same Prisma.user create input that I'm using inside the service layer right over here. Let's say if I did choose to use this to type annotate the DTO. Okay, so you're going to see that if I try to make a post request to the user's endpoint, let's just pass an empty object, you're going to see that it doesn't properly validate. It just gives us back this 500 internal server error. So it doesn't actually validate the request body for us. And since it's empty, it's going to go ahead and call this.users.createUser with an empty object that has nothing. And we need the username. So it's going to error out at the Prisma layer. Okay. So of course, I just wanted to show you all this and help you understand why we are using a combination of DTOs as well as the Prisma auto-generated inputs. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, one more thing that I want to show you is how to delete users. This is going to be pretty easy. So what we'll do is I'll implement a method called delete user by ID inside the user's service class. And it's going to take in just one argument, the ID. So what I'll do is I'll search for the user to see if the user actually exists. So const find user equals await this dot get user by ID. So I'm just going to reuse that method again. So if the user is not found, then we'll just throw a new exception or a new HTTP exception. And we'll just say user not found and then 404. Send a 404 status code. If the user is found, then all we need to do is just simply reference this.prisma.user, delete, and then you just set the where to an object and specify the ID just like this. It's the same thing that you would pass in when you're trying to find the user by the ID or the username. It's that easy. So now let's go ahead and call delete user by ID. So what I'll do is inside the user's controller, we're going to set up a delete request. So we're going to use the delete decorator, which is also imported from NestJS Common up top over here. And we need the route parameter, which is going to be an ID. And I'll call this method delete user by ID. It's going to have the same signature with the parameter, the route parameter, just like this. So I'm going to copy and paste that. And then I'll just return this.userService.delete user by ID and then pass in ID just like that. So now let's try to delete our users. So I'm going to delete the user of ID 3. Click send, and now you can see that it was deleted and we are returning the user back. If I try to delete this same user, again, you can see that it gives us a 4 for not found because the user doesn't exist. Okay, you could probably return a 400 instead or something else, maybe not 404, but just wanted to show you that. If I try to get the user, you can see that I can't even get that user by the ID because it doesn't exist anymore. If I try to query all users, you can see that we only have one user over here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to set up one-to-one relationships and as well as one-to-many relationships. So earlier we created 3 models. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to relate the user model with the user setting model. So the user and the user setting model are going to have a one-to-one relationship. So what that means is the user will only have one user setting record and the user setting record will only have one user record. So they kind of both point to each other. And if you think about it, it makes sense because in an actual application, a user itself only has really one set of configuration options, one settings, right? And that user settings that they have configured, maybe they enabled SMS text messages, they enabled email notifications, they enabled push notifications, things like that. You only really need one record for the user. And that user setting will also need to depend on an actual user itself. So they map one-to-one. So how we can define this in Prisma is actually pretty easy. So what we can do on the user side is we can go ahead and add another field. I'm going to call this user settings, or I'll call it user setting. And then what I want to do is use the user setting model as a type, just like this. Now, one thing to note is that the user setting could be undefined because the user may not have settings configured just yet. Remember that with a one-to-one relationship, in this case, the user itself can live without the user setting, okay? But the user setting does depend on the user in this case. Without the user, there's no user setting for that. So we want to mark this as optional. Now it's going to complain because on the other model, we need to define the inverse relation itself. So for user setting, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and reference user. So I'm going to say user and then We're going to reference the user model like a type, just like that. And then we want to use this relation annotation, just like this. And then what we want to do is we also want to define a user ID on user setting, just like this. And this user ID is actually going to be the foreign key, which is going to allow us to know who this settings belongs to. Okay, so that's what this user ID is for. And we also want to have it be an integer. It has to match the data type of the user ID. And then we're going to set this to be unique. So now going back to relation, we then want to set the fields, which is going to be an array. And you want to provide this user ID that we just have over here. This is going to be that foreign key that goes inside the fields array over here. And then we also want to add references. And then here we want to make sure that we are referencing the user model's ID. So we just pass an ID like that. Okay, so whatever you named the ID field for user, so if you name this user ID, then that is what this needs to be over here. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. So now what we can do is let's go back to our terminal. And I guess let me just create a new terminal. And we'll type npx Prisma Migrate dev -- name. And let's do user settings 121. So remember, every time we make a change, we always want to run a migration. So let's see what's going on over here. So it says a unique constraint covering the columns user ID on the table user setting will be added. If there are existing duplicate values, this will fail. Okay, so that should be okay. So we're going to hit yes, and it's going to go ahead and do everything, and it was successful, so that's good. So as I was saying, every time you make any changes to your models, you always have to run a migration. And you can see over here, if I go to this next migration, you can see that what it does is it alters the user setting table because we did create it initially. It alters the user setting table. It added this user ID column, and then it created an index on that user ID. And then over here, we altered the user setting table and added a constraint. So this is just adding the foreign key constraint to that user ID field. And then now what I'll do is inside my SQL Server, if I actually describe the user setting schema, you're going to see it has this user ID column right over here. And you can see that the key over here, it says uni. So let's say, for example, whenever I create a user, I want to also create a user setting record automatically. So what I can do is I can go into the user service inside our create user method. And first, we definitely want to make sure we are passing in the data to actually create the user. But in order to actually create that one-to-one relationship between the user and the user setting, what we need to do is first, we want to go ahead and actually pass all of the properties to configure for the user itself. So for example, we have username and display name. We want those to definitely get assigned. But for user setting though, we want to set this property like this. So this is going to map to an object, and this object has this create property right over here. And this create property is an object and maps to an object. And this is where you're going to actually set the properties for that relation. So if I try to reference the fields for a user setting record, so I can reference notifications and SMS enabled or notifications on. So first let's set SMS enabled to true and notifications on to false. So what this will do is this will first create the user record, and then it'll create a user setting record as well, and then relate the two records. So let's go ahead and try this out. So what I'll do is I'll go to my Thunder client, I'll make a post request, and let's set the username. Let's do Jack. Let's click send. So now you'll see that I can go ahead and create the new user. Now, currently, when we retrieve the response back, it doesn't show that user settings relation, but we can modify that. However, what I want to show you is if I go into my SQL server right now in the shell, and if I do select from user and then select from user setting, you're going to see now inside the user setting table, you can see that we have our first record and we have both columns notifications on and SMS enabled. So remember how earlier notifications on we set to false by default, and then SMS enabled we set to true. So 0 means false and then 1 means true. In SQL, this is a tiny int, so 1 or 0. And then you can see that the user ID, it maps to the user ID of 4. So this is the foreign key that points to the ID of 4 in the user table. So ID of 4 is Jack, so we know that this record belongs to Jack. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and actually include the relation whenever we query the user's endpoint. So right now, if I try to get a list of users, I can't see that user setting relation. So let's go ahead and modify that. So inside our getUsers method in our users service class, we're going to go ahead and pass an object into findMany. And in this object, we want to set this include property, which is an object. And this is where we can specify which relations we want to actually include when we query the users. So I'm going to set user setting just like this. And you can set this to a Boolean just like this. So now if I try to get a list of the users, it's going to go ahead and select the user as well as the user setting relation. And you can see down over here that the user setting relation has the user ID, the SMS enabled field, notifications on field, as well as the ID, the primary key of the user setting record itself. You could do the same thing for get user by ID as well, where I'm calling find unique. So for example, right now, if I try to get the user of ID 4, this will not include that relation of user setting, but we can easily modify that. So in this same object, I can set include just like this. And then I can pass in user setting, pass in that property. And I can set it to true, which would give me all of the relations, the relation and all of its fields. But let's say if I only wanted specific fields, let's say I only cared about notifications on and SMS enabled. So what I could do is instead of just setting user setting to true, I can actually set this to an object and use select to basically handpick what fields I want to include. So let's say I only cared about SMS enabled, set this to true, and then notifications on, set this to true. By setting it to true, you're just basically saying, okay, I want to actually include these fields. Okay, and if you don't specify which fields you want, then they're not going to be included. So by me omitting ID and user ID from here, it's not going to be included. So if I try to make the request, you're going to see now I don't have user ID or the ID field on the user setting relation. Okay, so this is very useful actually when you only want certain fields to be selected. And also if you're using something like GraphQL, it makes it very easy for you to only handpick the fields that you actually want. I'll show you one example where we can update the user's settings by the user ID. So let's go ahead and set up a patch request, and this will have the path of settings. And then we'll call the method update user settings by user ID. So we're going to need the route parameter, of course. So let's do this. I'm actually going to do :ID/settings. So the path would look like patch, users, and then ID, settings. Okay. And this is obviously useful if you have an application where you want the user to be able to, let's say, turn on and off certain settings. So for example, if we want the user to disable SMS texts or enable notifications, then this is what it translates to in a realistic application. So we're going to grab the route parameter. So let me just copy this part because it's the same exact thing. We're going to get the route parameter, and then we also need a DTO to represent the settings that the user is trying to use to update. So let's go over to, let's create a new DTO. Let's call this update user settings .dto.ts. So create a class, call it update user settings DTO. And we only need 2 fields because we only have 2 settings. So we only need notifications on and SMS enabled. And both of these will be optional. So SMS enabled, this is a Boolean. And then notifications on, this is also going to be a Boolean. Let's make sure we use our class validator decorators. So let's do is optional. And I think there should be one called is Boolean. Yep, is Boolean, just like that. And then we'll do the same thing for notifications on. And let me also mark these fields as optional using the question mark. Okay, so I think that's it for the update user settings DTO. So let's exit out of this file. And let's go back to the controller. So let's go ahead and set up the request body. So we're going to use the body decorator, and we'll call the argument update user settings DTO. Type annotate with update user settings DTO, just like that. And then now we just need to go ahead and call a method in the user service layer. Again, I would recommend you have a separate user settings module where you have a user settings controller and a user settings service, because you want to keep these things separate. But just to keep things simple, we'll use the same user service to handle this. So inside the user service class, I'll set up a method called update user settings, and it's going to need the ID of the user. So let me actually name this user ID instead, just so that way we are not confused between the user ID as well as the settings ID. And then the settings data, I'll actually call it data instead. And this time I'm going to use the Prisma auto-generated types. So Prisma dot, and remember that whenever you have any models in your schema.prisma file, their types will be auto-generated for you when you run Prisma generate. Okay, so in this situation over here, because right now our type that we're working with is user setting, so there's this Prisma dot user setting, so the name of the model, and then since we want to update user setting, we really actually don't want to have create input, because this is for creating. So there should actually be one for update, I believe. Yep, user setting update input right over here. And you can see that it has all of these fields that are optional. So notifications on, SMS enabled, user. So let's go ahead and leave it like this. And now what we'll do is this. So inside this method, we want to first search for the user by the ID, so we can reuse our get user by ID method. In this situation though, I do want to make sure that I am selecting the user setting relation, because if the user does not have settings enabled, then they cannot update it. But you can choose to also create the user settings if they don't have settings enabled. But it's totally up to you on how you want to implement this. So that, I'm just bringing this up right now. But what I'll do is first, let's search for the user. And we need to use async and await. So await this dot get user by ID, passing the user ID just like that. And then what I'll do is if the user does not exist, then we'll throw a new HTTP exception, user not found, and then send a 404. Let's say if the user does not have settings enabled. Again, like I said, you can choose to just create it manually. So if find user dot settings or user setting is undefined, then you can choose what you want to do, either create the settings or just throw an error. It's up to you. But typically they should have user settings because we are creating it by default. So what I'll do is I'll actually just throw an error, and I'll throw an exception, and I'll just say bad request. Okay, so we handled these two cases. So now we know that the user is found and user settings is in fact populated. It's defined. So we can go ahead and update the user settings. So what we can do is we can reference this.prisma.user setting instead of user. And then what we can do is we can call update. Okay. And now this is going to be a little bit tricky because remember, we don't have the user setting ID. We have the user ID. So what we can do is we can set where, and we can pass in user ID like this. Okay. So we're searching for the user setting by the user ID. Remember that user setting record. Let me go back to the table over here. Remember the user setting table? It has this user ID, which is a foreign key. So we're basically searching for the user by the user ID, the foreign key itself. Okay. And because there is a one-to-one relationship, there shouldn't be any duplicates in this table where there's two records with the user ID of 4 in this case. Okay, because it's a one-to-one relationship. So we'll search for the user by the ID, and then for the data, this is just going to be whatever this data argument is, which is user setting update input. So that's basically going to contain the notifications on and SMS enabled property. So this will update the user setting, and we can just easily return this just like that. And then we're done. So let's go ahead and go back to our user controller. And let's go ahead and call this.userService.update user settings, pass the user ID, as well as the user settings DTO, just like this. And now let's go ahead and make a patch request to this endpoint. So what I want to do is I'll try to test it out with the user of ID 1 first. So I'll make a patch request to users1 settings, and this should return an error, or it should return a status code of 400 because user settings is null. So if I click send, you're going to see it says bad request, and that is coming from the service layer right over here because we don't have a user setting defined. Okay, I can also change this to no settings, like that, and then it would say this. Again, like I said, I would recommend you guys to actually create the user settings in a situation like this. So you could probably just do what I am doing earlier. So you would just call this.prisma.usersetting.create and just pass an SMS enabled and notifications on. So now let's go ahead and try to update the other user. So I think the ID was 4. And let's go ahead and do this. So for the user of ID 4, they have notifications disabled and SMS enabled. So what we'll do is we'll set SMS enabled to false. And we'll just configure this one. Click send. And now you can see that SMS enabled is now false and notifications on is false. And if I try to select the user setting again from MySQL, you can see that it's now being properly updated in the database table. Let's go ahead and enable both. So notifications on, set this to true. And now they're both set to true. And if I try to query the user with ID 4, you can see that both of their settings are set to true. So that's good. So that shows you how to update the actual individual relation itself. So now what I'll do is I'll show you how we can define a one-to-many and many-to-one relationship between the user and our post model that we had created earlier. So let's say, for example, you're building some kind of blogging platform where users can create posts, and they can create as many posts as they want. But each post will only have one author or one user that created at most. Okay? So this is known as a one-to-many, many-to-one relationship because the user can have as many posts as they want, and the post will only belong to one single user. Okay, in some situations where you have a post that can belong to many users, so maybe you have multiple authors that create a post, that would be known as a many-to-many relationship between the user and the post. So to define the one-to-many and many-to-one relationship, what we want to do is first, for the user model, we're going to go ahead and set this posts field, just like this. And the type is going to be post and then square bracket. And all this means is that it is a one-to-many relationship. Okay. Then we have to go to the post model, and then we have to define the relationship the opposite side. Okay, so for the post, we have to go ahead and set up the user field. So you can call this whatever you want. You can call it user, you can call it author, whatever you prefer. I'm just going to call it user, and the type will be user just like this. I also want to make sure that I set up the user ID field as well, which is going to be an integer. And again, remember, this user ID field will be a foreign key, and that foreign key is basically just going to be the ID of the user itself. So that way we know who this post belongs to, which user this post belongs to. So we're not done yet. Where we have our user field being defined in our post model, we need to also use the relation annotation just like this. And it's going to look very similar when we define our one-to-one relationship. Okay, so inside the relation annotation, we want to set this fields property, which is going to be an array, and you want to pass in this user ID field that you just defined for post. So user ID, just like that. And then you also want to set the references array right over here. And this needs to point to the ID of the user itself. So this ID field right over here. So I'm just going to go ahead and put ID. And now you can see that the linting error goes away. So that is good. All right, so now that we are done with setting up our one-to-many and many-to-one relationship, what we need to do is let's go back into our terminal. So let's go into our terminal. And I'm going to go ahead and run the same command, npx prisma migrate dev, and then -- name. And I'll just call this init user post 1 to many. All right, so this ran the migration, it applied it, and let's see, it says operation not permitted. So yeah, I think the reason why it failed was because we had our application running. It was a permission issue. So let's go ahead and try again because I just closed the application. So what I'll do is I should be able to rerun the same migration based on the name. So the name was init user post 1 to many. So let's try this, npx prisma migrate dev -- name init user post 1 to many. All right, there you go. So now it seems like everything worked and there were no issues. So to verify, let's go back into our MySQL session right over here. And what I'll do is let's describe the post table. And you can now see that we do in fact have the user ID field. So that's good. And yeah, okay, that's good. So it seems like everything is good. So it seems like that worked. So let's run our application again, make sure there's no issues going on. Okay, wonderful. All right, so now let's go ahead and try to create an actual post based on the user itself. So what we can do is let's go inside our post controller. So I set this up earlier, as I mentioned. So this will be the posts endpoint where we will create posts on behalf of the user. And of course, we need to know who the user is. Now, in this case, we don't have authentication set up. We don't have passport, or we don't have any JWTs. So I'm just going to have the ID being passed in the route parameter. But of course, if you have authentication set up, then you should know how to figure out who the user is. So if you're using passport.js with sessions, then you'll know that the user object is attached to the request object. So that's how you can know who the user is, and that's how you can get the user ID. So in this case, like I said, I'll just use the route parameter. So let's set up a post request. And what we'll do is this. I'm not going to use the route parameter. I'm actually just going to use the request body to include the user ID instead, because I think it would be weird having it in the route parameter anyways. So we'll create this method called create post, and we need a DTO for the post. for creating the post. So let's create a new folder. It's called DTOs. So inside the posts folder, we created the DTOs folder. And now what I'll do is I'll create a new file and I'll call this createPost.dto.ts. And this will be a class called createPostDTO. And we need a title description. So let's go ahead and do that first. So title string, description string. Both of these are going to be required. And then we need the user ID, which is going to be a number. Let's go ahead and use our class validator decorators. So let's do isString is not empty. You can also set a max title on this as well, max length. A max length for the title. So you could do something like max length of 200 characters. Or we'll leave like 200 for now. And then we'll do the same thing for description. For the max length, we'll not set max length for that. And then for user ID is number is not empty. Okay, so now let's go into our post controller and we'll go ahead and first apply the pipe for validation. So use pipes validation pipe, both of which are imported from NestJS Common. And then we'll use the @body decorator. And the name of the argument will be createPostDTO. Type annotate that with createPostDTO. So we also need to inject our post service into the post controller. So let's do that very quickly. So let's do private post service. Okay, and keep in mind that, again, all of these controllers and services are already configured with the post module, and the post module is already imported into the app module. Okay, so let's go ahead, and now we want to go ahead and call the post service. So the post service will have a method that we need to implement. It'll just be called createPost, and it'll just take in this createPostDTO object. So now we can go into our post service class, and we need to first inject the Prisma service into post service, but we need to also make sure inside our posts module that we have the Prisma module imported. So I'm going to go ahead and add this imports property inside the object for module, and then we're going to go ahead and import Prisma module just like that, and then add it inside the imports array. So now we can go into post service, and we can just inject the Prisma service into our post service class, just like this. So let's go ahead and implement that create post method. So create post, and for the arguments, it is going to be Prisma. We need to import that from Prisma client. And then now, since we're dealing with posts, we're going to go ahead and reference the generated post types for our post model. So since we're creating a post, it would be post create input, just like this, post create input. So similar to how when we were creating our users, we had user create input. For post, we have post create input. So it's always the name of the model and then create input. That's the generated types from Prisma. So we want to create the post. So what we want to do is we want to reference this.prisma.post and then call create. And then for the data, keep in mind that the data over here is going to require the title, the description, and then now for this situation, we want to make sure we provide the user ID here. So that way we know which user this post belongs to. So luckily, our DTO right over here has all of these exact fields: title, description, and user ID. So we can use it. So we don't have to obviously type out all of this. We can just pass data like that or like this. So now let's go ahead and just return this call, and let's take a look at our controller. So you can see over here, it is giving us this linting issue. So the reason why this is happening is because we are trying to pass this object, the createPostDTO, and we don't have this user property because post create input expects the user property to be present. So there's obviously an issue going on over here. So there's a few ways that we can address this. So for example, the easiest thing that we could do is instead of type annotating data with prisma.postCreateInput, we could just type annotate it with the DTO. But there's also this other generated type for post called postCreate without user input. And the name of it is pretty self-explanatory. It just pretty much has the same exact input without the user field itself. If you hover over it, now you can see the type definition only has two properties, title and description. And optionally, you can actually provide user ID for the data. So I think the best thing to do is for the data itself, we should only pass the title and description for the first argument and then the user ID as a second argument. Okay, so for example, let's do this. Let's go ahead inside our controller where I have my create post method declared over here and defined. I'm going to go ahead and destructure the user ID and destructure everything else. I'm going to call it create post data instead. And then in the posts service create post method, I'm going to change the signature of this method. I'm going to go ahead and first pass the user ID, and then I'll pass the data. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's remove this, let's do user ID. So let's go ahead and pass user ID and then create post data just like this. And inside our create post method for post service, what we'll do is we still need to set this data property. So you can see that it still expects title description, but user or user ID are both optional. So what I'll do is I'll destructure all of data. So everything that is inside this data object, which only has two properties, title and description. And then we'll set the user ID like this. And now the error will go away. And we should be able to create a post now. So let's go ahead and try. So I have this post request set up already. So I have my title, I have my description, and I have my user ID set to the ID of 4. So let's click send. And now you can see we have our first post and it has our user ID right over here. And I can keep creating as many posts as I want for this user. Let's say if I pass an invalid user ID, you're going to see it says status code 500. So likely an error happened on the backend because that user does not exist. But if I try to pass user ID 1, because there is in fact a user with an ID of 1, you're going to see it just works just fine. Okay, let's go ahead and get the users again. You can see we still only have 2 users. So now let's go ahead and modify our user service. We want to be able to get the user's posts as well. So we can go to get user by ID, and then where we have our include property set, we can go ahead and do posts and set this to true. So this would give me all of the posts as well whenever I query the user by the ID. So watch this. If I try to get the user of ID 1, I not only get the user itself, but I also get the user setting, which is null, and I get all of the user's posts just like that. And again, you can of course create your own endpoint to retrieve the user's posts. So you could create something like users 1 and then /posts, and then have the post service take care of getting all the posts for the user. So now I will show you how to deal with many-to-many relationships and set them up using Prisma. So what we'll do is I'll actually create a completely separate model that is different from post, because I don't want to reuse this because I'm concerned that it might possibly break our data. And I just want to do this for the sake of demonstration and keep it simple. So I'll create a new model and I'll call this group post just like this. So this group post will have multiple users as the author. So sometimes you might have some kind of article, some kind of blog post that can be collaborated with multiple people. So in this situation, you would have a user having many group posts, and then the group post would have many users. So this is known as a many-to-many relationship. For the group post, we're going to need a primary key. So let's set that up. Let's set up a title and then a description. We'll keep it like this for now. Now, to represent a many-to-many relationship between the user and group post, we need to actually create another model. And this model actually would translate to a junction table in the database in SQL. So we're going to go ahead and call this user on group posts, just like this. So this user on group posts would be a junction table in the SQL database. And the junction table, really all that is, it's basically just a table that contains the primary key columns of the 2 tables that we're trying to relate with each other. So for example, we're trying to relate user and group post with a many-to-many relationship. So this user on group posts junction table will have both the user and the group posts primary keys. So that way we know which user belongs to the group post and which group post belongs to the user. So hopefully that makes sense. So to set up this user on groups posts model, what we need to do is first we need to have our user defined as a field. So it's going to look like this, user, and I'll get to the annotations in just a second. We need the user ID, which is an integer, and then we need the group post itself. So group post of type group post, just like that. And then group post ID int. And now let's get to the annotations. So for the user field, we want to use the relation annotation, and we want to set fields to point to user ID. And then for references, this will have to point to the ID of the user model. So just ID, just like that. Okay. And then now we'll set up the relation for group post. So it's going to be very similar. So fields, this will point to group post ID, and it references, and then it references the ID of group post model, just like that. Okay. So we created this model that represents a junction table. And the last thing that we do need to do though inside this model is we need to use this double at ID. And this double at ID is also another attribute. And all this means is it just defines a multi-field ID of this model. So you need this for the junction table. So what we want to do is we want to pass in an array, and we want to contain both of the IDs for user and group post. We have the user ID right over here, so we want to reference this user ID, and then group post ID right over here. So now that we're done with this model, let's go to the user model first, and we want to define the relation on the user model side. So we'll go ahead and set the field for user. We'll go ahead and do group posts, and this will be user on group posts like this with the square brackets at the end. And then we'll do the same thing for the group post model, but it will be users instead. And then user on group post like that. And that's it. We're done. So now let's go ahead and run the migration. So let's go to our terminal. I'll make sure I terminate the application process. And let's type npx Prisma Migrate dev -name init. And I'll just call this many-to-many. Just keep it simple. And let's make sure everything was done successfully. So it seems like everything worked, and that's good. So let's close the terminal, and let's go ahead and take a look at the migration.sql file that was created so you can see what's going on. So first, it created the group post table because we didn't have that. Then it created this user on group post table. And again, this is the junction table right over here, and you'll notice how it has two primary keys this time, user ID and group post ID. And then down over here, you can see that on the same table, they added a foreign key on user ID, which references the ID of the user. And did the same thing for the group post ID as well. Okay. So again, you'll better understand this once we actually start to populate the data in our database, and you'll see how that data will look like in the form of a table. All right. So now that we have this all set up, we can go ahead and actually begin creating group posts. So just to keep things simple, again, I'll reuse the same post controller. So this time, what we'll do is we'll create a single group post, and then we'll have it assigned to 2 users. Okay. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's do at posts or at post, and then we'll do group. So the way that this endpoint will look like is posts group, which means this will be a group post. We'll do create group post as the name of the method. And we will need a request body. Okay. So let's go ahead and create a new DTO. Create group post.dto.ts. And it's going to look very similar to our create post DTO right over here. The only difference really, let me just make sure that title and description are the same. Okay, let's see. Yep, it is. Title and description are the same. That's good. Okay, wonderful. So the only difference is instead of just having one single user ID, we're going to actually have an array of user IDs. This time, the way that validation is going to work is going to be a little bit different because we're validating an array and not just a single scalar value. So what I can do is for the isNumber decorator, it takes in two arguments. It takes in isNumber options and also validation options, both of which are optional. So I really only need validation options, which is the second argument. So I'll just pass an empty object for the first one. And then for validation options, the second object, I'm going to go ahead and set this each property to true. And this will ensure that it validates each value in the array if user ID is an array, which it is. Okay, so this will ensure that every single element in user ID is a number. We'll do the same thing for isNotEmpty, but isNotEmpty only takes in one object, one argument, which is validation options. So we'll set each to true as well. Additionally, I also want to make sure that the value for user ID is an array. So I can use the isArray decorator to make sure that it is in fact an array. So let's go into our post controller. And first, let's apply the validation pipe on create group post. And then now let's go ahead and extract the request body. So create group post DTO, and then type annotate it with create group post DTO, just like that. So let's just test out our endpoint, make sure that it works. So I'll go ahead and make a post request to posts/group, just like that. And we'll pass a request body. And now it's going to go ahead and validate everything for us. So title and description, as well as user ID, are all missing. So let's do hello world. Description, let's just do the same thing, hello world. And then let's also see what happens if I don't pass user ID. You can see that user ID must be an array. So user ID. Now, the other problem is that I could also pass in an empty array. So let's actually fix this. Let's make sure that it is not empty. So there's a decorator called array not empty. So I can do array not empty, just like that. So this will ensure that the user ID array is not empty. So if I go over here, if I click send, now it says user ID should not be empty. So that's good. So we have everything properly validated. Okay. So now you can see that if I pass in a value for the user ID array, it works. So let's go ahead and go into our posts service class. So we're going to implement the method where we're going to create a group post. Okay, again, like I said, we're going to use this same posts service, but ideally you would want to create a separate module to handle a different domain because a group post is different than a regular post. So I'll go ahead and create a method called create group post, just like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to reference this.prisma.group post just like this. Okay, so we're going to create a group post regularly, just like this, call create method. And the data is going to be pretty much the same thing as a regular post, right? It's going to have title, it's going to have description, but then we want to also make sure we have all of the user IDs that are mapped to the group post. Okay, so that way we know which users have contributed to this group post. So what we can do in this situation is there's this property. Remember, we have this users property right over here. Okay, and this is going to map to an object. And we can use this create property. And this is actually going to be an array this time. Okay, you'll notice that this is really similar to earlier when we were creating a one-to-one relationship between the user and user setting. Remember how we used create, but this was an object because that was only one-to-one. But this time we have multiple users that we want to create for this group post. Well, not create the users, but kind of like connect the user to the group post itself. So inside this array for create, we would pass in the actual user ID. So just like this, we'd pass in the user ID, just like that. So this would create the group post and then relate it to the user of ID 1. And if you had other users, you would pass them as well, like this. Okay, so I just wanted to show you the structure of how it's going to look like, but let's go ahead and just remove all of this. Remove this as well. And let's take in the arguments for create group post. So this is going to be a little bit tricky, okay? Because, for example, if we were to use the Prisma auto-generated type, so there should be one for group post. Let's see, create group or group post create input. And if we look at the type definition, you can see that we have title descriptions, and then the users would be user on group post create nested menu without group post input. So this itself seems a little bit sophisticated. So what I'm going to do is this. We'll do group post without users input. So we'll just have the title and description, and we'll pass the user ID separate. So first, let me do this. I'll do user IDs, which is going to be an array of numbers. And we'll pass in the data, which is only going to contain the title and description. So it's going to be similar to what we did earlier with creating a single post for just one user. So the way that this is going to work is for data, I'm going to go ahead and use the spreader operator on the data object itself. So this will unpack all of the fields inside the object, so title and description. And then we're going to go ahead and set users, just like this, to be an object, and set create. And then what I'm going to do is, because I know that this is an array, I'm going to reference user IDs.map. So I'm going to take each ID and put it in an object. So I'm transforming this user IDs array of numbers into an array of objects that has a property called user ID. Okay, because remember, the array takes in an object, or it contains objects that have this user ID property. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do user IDs.map, and then for each user ID, we're just going to return the user ID. Okay, so the user ID property maps to the user ID value itself. So do it shorthand would look like this. So let's go ahead and return this call. And now we'll go ahead and go into our create group post method inside post controller. And we'll just do return this.post service.create group post. We'll first pass in the user IDs. So let me go ahead and destructure user ID. I should have named this user ID. Let me fix that real quick. User IDs with an S. So user IDs, and then create group post data. And then we'll pass in user IDs and then create group post data. And there's no issues with this. So let's go back to our Thunder client. Let me change this to user IDs. And if I try to send this, it's going to say user ID should not be empty. So that's good. So I know that there are two users. I have a user of ID 1 and of ID 4. So let's pass 1 for now. And let's see what happens. Okay, so it created this post. So let's go ahead and take a look at our tables. So let's take a look at group post first. Select from group post. So you can see I have my group post. Let's take a look at user on group post table. And let's see what that looks like. You can see that inside the user on group post table, and remember, this is the junction table that I was talking about that has a combination of all of our primary keys for user ID and group post ID. So what this tells me right over here is that the group post of ID 1 has only one user of ID 1. Okay, so this group post, although this is a group post, it only has one user or one author. So now let's create another post. Let's add 2 users this time. Let's do 1 and 4. And now you can see I have my post created. But let's go ahead and select that user on group post junction table again. And now you can see that it added 2 new records to this table. So if you look right over here, we have a group post ID of 2, and you can see that right over here, it has user ID of 1. And then on the next record, it has group post ID of 2, and then user ID of 4. So what this tells me is that on the group post with an ID of 2, it has 2 users that this group post belongs to. Okay? So now this is how the many-to-many relationship looks like. You have a user that has many group posts, and the group post has many users. Okay? So let's just very quickly set up an endpoint to get all the group posts. So let's do this. Let's set up a GET request. I need to import the decorator. So let's do that. And we'll do group. So this will be get posts group. And then we'll call this method get group posts. And this will call a method this dot posts service dot get group posts. So we need to implement that method in the post service class. So let's do that. So get group posts. We're going to go ahead and return this .prisma. So now we want to get all the group posts. So we'll do group posts .find many. And let's see what happens if I try to make a GET request. Let's do this. So you can see that I have all of my group posts, but it does not show the users. So let's go ahead and make sure we do that. So inside our post service class, inside get group posts, inside the find many call, we're going to pass in this object. And remember, we want to include the relation. So we want to include users, set this to true. And let's take a look at what the data will look like. So notice how now if I click send, you can see that over here, we have this users, which is an array. And you can see that it has this user ID of 1, group post ID 1. And over here it has user ID 1 and then user ID 4. Okay, so this looks a little bit weird because it's actually getting the data from the junction table itself. So we'll replace this value of true. We'll map users to an object. And we'll do this. We'll do select. And let's just select the user, because what it's doing is it's selecting group post ID. That's why over here you're seeing the group post ID and the user ID. But let's select the user itself. Well, let's see what happens. So if I click send, now you can see that, let me zoom out a little bit. You can see that for each group post, I have the array of users, and this is an actual user object itself. Okay, you have this array, and then in each object, it has this user property, and then it has this user record over here, which has the ID, username, and display name. Down over here, we have the same thing, though we have 2 users this time. So we have the user, and then we have, let's see, Anson, and then Jack. Okay, so this is how you can handle many-to-many relationships for your application. So that is going to be pretty much it for this video. I wanted to make sure we covered all of the basic CRUD functionalities using Prisma, how to create data, how to read data from the database, update data, as well as deleting data. And then I also wanted to make sure I showed you all how to handle one-to-one relationships, one-to-many, many-to-one relationships, as well as many-to-many relationships. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you liked this video, definitely leave a like down below. If you have any questions, feel free to join the Discord server. The link is in the description. And comment down below what you would like to see in future videos on this channel. So thank you so much, and I will see you all in my next video. Peace out.